Our focus point will be on Birmingham, Alabama, because this is where all the watercress darters are confined at and they're found at. Alabama does have diverse freshwater fish fauna, but many of the fish species still face extinction. Most of the imperiled species are found within cold water springs in Alabama, but there's a lack of knowledge on their ecology, so that really hampers with background. They are in the perch family, and they are sort of described as the hummingbirds of the fish world because they are very small, colorful, and quick. The watercress darter will be the focus of our presentation today, though, and you can see that on the bottom right. This fish is very colorful and very small in size. It's only about 2.5 inches in length, I believe, and it is a federally endangered listed species. And on the left, that's just a mural that is in Birmingham, Alabama of the watercress darter. So the population size for the watercress darters is very difficult to determine. This is because scientists have to catch watercress darters in seine nets, so there's just not an exact number of how big the population is. But from what scientists have found, the population seems to be decreasing in natural population areas. The watercress darters are confined to 5 springs in Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, and they're mostly found in pools and runs. Runs are just the little streams that flow out of the pools. But scientists believe Roebuck Springs holds the biggest population of the watercress darters. And you can see all the springs in this little photo on the bottom of the screen. And we'll get back to what makes them federally endangered. But there was 2 studies conducted, give an example of population size for the watercress darters. Our expert that will be presenting later on to give us these studies, these are both focused on Roebuck Springs. One of them was just they were looking in the runs to see how many watercress darters there was in this spring, and they found about 117,000. And then there was also a dam removal in Roebuck Springs, which caused the mortality of about 12,000 watercress darters. So we can see there's quite a lot just within this spring. So, I mean, what makes them federally endangered? Well, when they found them back in the 70s, they were only found in one spring, which is why a lot of people believe that was probably why they were listed as federally endangered. But also when they were sampling, Roebuck Springs to see how much there was, they did find more juveniles than adults. About 2/3 of the fish they found were juveniles. And then they are confined to these 5 springs. So, if one thing happens, I feel like that would be pretty detrimental, like the dam removal. So that could be another reason why they're federally endangered. So for the habitat, as I mentioned, they're restricted to 5 springs in the metropolitan area of Birmingham, Alabama. And these 5 springs were listed on the previous slide in that little photo. They are found primarily in spring pools and spring runs. And what is the environment like in these springs? Well, they're very, very vegetated. They're vegetated with watercress, aquatic moss, stonewort, and green algae. And that attracts a large community of aquatic insects. And not only that, but these springs are great for foraging. Not only do they have insects, but they have snails and crustaceans as well. And they're great for reproduction. These photos are examples of what Roebuck Springs looks like. This is the spring that they believe the most watercress darters are in. But the reproduction is great because, watercress darters really rely on that aquatic vegetation to deposit their eggs.
There are quite a few major threats to the species. Perhaps the most significant are the first 2 on this list: habitat modification and proximity to humans. These darters are found in just a few pools in the Birmingham, Alabama area. With such a limited range and the inability to move elsewhere, these fish suffer when their habitat is altered through stream channelization, flow modification, development, and polluted runoff. Additionally, invasive species like grass carp consume large amounts of dense vegetation that the watercress darter requires. Since these darters exist in such low numbers and limited populations, there's low genetic diversity. Usually for a spring darter like these that are isolated to specific pools with constant conditions, low genetic diversity is not really a problem, but since their conditions are now changing, having a limited gene pool is posing a problem in terms of ability to adapt. Finally, there's generally just a lack of knowledge about this species, and so coming up with ways to study it and to conserve it can be difficult. This map shows the limited range of this species, and as you can see, this dark patch in northern Alabama is the only place that these darters are found. The watercress darter is a federally endangered species, so it receives all the protections afforded to endangered species, including habitat protections. The Clean Water Act is also very important for this fish since its habitat is so limited and the populations have found themselves surrounded by the greater Birmingham area. There are also land trusts and federal refuges that are attempting to protect, conserve, and restore the habitat of these fish by protecting surrounding land and managing land use. Since development is a major threat to these darters, having these federal protections and land ownership really goes a long way to preventing additional harm. There are also nonprofit groups and NGOs that patrol around and hold polluting companies accountable. The Clean Water Act is great, but unless it's enforced, it doesn't do much. The Black Warrior Riverkeepers, though, make sure that it's enforced and confront and sometimes sue companies that are spotted polluting in its habitat. Policy and regulations to protect this fish are really established and enforced as a joint effort by all parties involved. This species has been largely researched through habitat and population surveys, where they collect and ID plants to determine the habitat, and then they also collect darters themselves using seine nets and novel throw traps, but not electrofishing because that will harm the darter. They also conduct genetic analyses, and they've determined that there are 3 distinct subpopulations that they would like to keep genetically isolated. There have been a few failed interventions, for example, the transfer of watercress darters to Tapawingo Springs, Prince and Avondale Springs. All of these have failed, and in some cases the darter has actually become an invasive species and harmed the species that were already living there. There's also been a situation where a dam was removed, which killed a lot of darters, and then it was replaced, and the replacement has not really been up to snuff.
So our expert that will be presenting in our presentation about the watercress darters is Dr. Bernie Kuhajda. His areas of expertise include ichthyology, field biology, and cave biology. Dr. Kuhajda joined the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute staff in 2012 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. After 25 years at the University of Alabama, where he managed a museum collection of 1 million specimens of preserved fishes from all around the world. His particular expertise is surveying and monitoring threatened and endangered species from aquatic systems in the Southeast, in part to help evaluate the effectiveness of conservation programs. He also serves on multiple USFWS recovery teams/groups for endangered and threatened species, and watercress darters are one of the species he has worked with for a very long time.
So the basic thing you do with any threatened endangered species is you need to know where it's found and what is its trajectory and what shape is the habitat in. And you do that with status surveys. So again, you can just survey a species, survey a species, survey a species, and it's going bad, 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 and you don't do anything, and that doesn't help. So the next important thing, and then also we look for new populations in similar habitat where no one maybe has looked before. Then the next thing is you've got to know the population genetics of the species. If you don't understand what genetically distinct populations are present in that endangered species, you can't formulate a recovery plan. You really can't. And I've either peer-reviewed or been an expert team member on a lot of species status assessments. And if you don't have an understanding of the genetics of that species, which a lot of them we don't, you are just guessing at how to properly manage this and recover this species.
I was wondering if you would explain some of the reasons there was a decline in the population due to the small dam removal on Roebuck Spring and some of the restoration efforts that were put into place following the decline.
Most fishes, they live in an environment where water goes up and water goes down, and they adjust accordingly. The problem with a spring fish is it lives in a stable habitat. I mean, the temperature's pretty much the same year round. The flow's pretty much the same year round. The depth's pretty much the same year round. And so, and darters that live in vegetation, when they get scared, they dive into the vegetation. That's where they hide. So when you remove a dam and the water levels drop like that, the fish don't swim down, stream fish, they might swim downstream and get out of the pool. But watercress darters, they just buried into the aquatic vegetation and were left high and dry. I suggested you want to put in small little structures like this, like curbs, put in a bunch of them with little notches in them so fish can move up and down, and put that over like 20, 30 meters, and then you get your spring pool eventually, or have like a wheelchair area with little stones in the concrete for the fish to find their way so you could get flow back and forth. But they decided just to put back in an earthen dam. That was the second part of recovering the habitat. The problem with that is anytime you get submergent aquatic vegetation dislodged and it floats to the surface, of course, the current takes it down to that stand pipe. It's a stand square, but it doesn't go over it. And so you get this buildup, and half the spring pool is covered with floating vegetation that would have gone over the dam in the old dam, and it blocks out all the sunlight. So now half your pool doesn't have any aquatic vegetation on the bottom. Anyway, but they have improved habitat tremendously in the spring run. Freshwater Land Trust and partners for Fish and Wildlife. And the parking lot used to have all the rainwater that fell on the parking lot. There's a recreation center right there, and it would go right into the spring run. They've now diverted that elsewhere, and they put native grasses and stuff along the edge of the spring run. So it's in a lot better shape in a lot of areas where you don't have hot water coming off, a summer rain of a parking lot going into the cold spring run.
And you mentioned that there are these 3 subpopulations that you see, the distinct subpopulations, and in the paper, the authors advocate for keeping those distinct.
Yep.
Do you see a situation in which it would be beneficial for the species as a whole to intermix those genetic pools? Say if one is shrinking dramatically, is the preferred outcome then to lose that subspecies and preserve the 2 others genetically? Or is there a situation where it would be beneficial, or you think it would be a realistic solution to mix those gene pools in order to preserve the species as a whole?
Okay, good question. Really good question. Okay, so the reason that if you find these genetically distinct populations, let me quickly go back. You guys know island biogeography? Like you get these really narrow endemic species on islands because there's the ancestor from the mainland. It establishes, it's completely isolated. There's no gene flow, and you get all these different cool species in islands. Well, springs are islands. There are these habitats that are isolated. They're the same temperature year round. It is natural for them to have distinct populations and fairly low genetic diversity, but they can survive the low genetic diversity because everything's stable. They don't have to worry about changing temperature, changing flows. They're adapted really well to that one spring or those 2 springs like Thomas and Glen that are in the same little creek system. And that's why you don't want to mix them, because you may actually do more harm, because now you've got genes that are adapted to 7 springs, which is a completely different spring than Thomas Spring. And they may not do as well, and they pass on those not do as well genes when they hybridize with the watercress darters in Thomas Spring. Now you've actually hurt more than you've helped.
Why do you think like these some of these species, that's just kind of the way it's going to be? They're out there. There's not going to be a lot of improvement. It is what it is. What do we do?
You led me into my favorite rant. You ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. So we did another paper, and this was we looked at 290 watersheds, and I've always really thought that the Southeast gets very little funding, state and federal money, for endangered species compared to the rest of the country. Fish and Wildlife puts out the state and federal expenditures on every endangered animal in the United States for fiscal year 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16. I did it for this paper that came out in 18. Okay, are you ready? So what I did is I looked at fishes that were within the Southeast and fishes that were outside the Southeast, and I threw out the ones that were found both. These are threatened endangered fishes. And for every dollar spent in the Southeast on a threatened or endangered fish, there were $42 spent outside the Southeast. Let that sink in. Here's another way of looking at the same numbers. You ready? There's 30% of the threatened and endangered fishes in the United States are found in the Southeast. We get 0.9% of the funding.
What are some ways do you think we can educate stakeholders or the public in general, and also raise awareness to where they can understand how important it is to protect an endangered species such as the watercress darters? How do we get them to care for species such as this, like they care for elephants and polar bears? And are there specific methods of education you have used before when it comes to stakeholders and the general public?
So that's first what you do is you make the public aware that is physically right there, that it's there. You need to try to get stories every now and then in the local media about the watercress darter and the vermilion darter and the rush darter. And the press, unless you have a really good reporter that comes to you for the story, you've got to go to the press and say, hey, we're doing a survey for watercress darters on this day. You want to come out and cover us? And that's what I did when I was at the University of Alabama. And you have to get a reason why you should care. And here's my elevator pitch. We all need fresh water. Humans need fresh water. We need clean fresh water. And we really like clean fresh water to go swimming in, kayaking in, paddle boarding, inner tubing. And some of us really like clean fresh water to catch fish and eat them. Who do you think cleans that water? Is there like big filters in the river that are cleaning the water? No, it's the aquatic ecosystem. You've got algae, you've got bacteria, you've got snails, mussels, crawdads, fishes, hundreds of species all working together in mysterious and wonderful ways to clean our water. Every time you lose a species, you take a brick out of that foundation. Yeah. So that's why you need to be concerned about a watercress darter. They're part of that ecosystem that gives you, as humans, clean water to drink and play in.
We'd like to thank Dr. Bernie Kuhajda for taking about an hour and a half of his time to speak with us. If you find yourself in the Chattanooga area, swing by the Tennessee Aquarium. And lastly, down at the bottom, I've linked the page for Dr. Bernie Kuhajda's publications if anyone is interested.